Hello and welcome to the whose turn is it? Is it the Gentry and Seth show this week?
It's always Gentry and Seth show on Dogs 24/7.
Next year it's going to be the Seth and Seth show because I'm going to jettison this loser. We're going to talk a little bit about the BCS championship game in Georgia against Notre Dame, or should we not do that quite yet?
A little bit early. Everybody seems to be thinking that it's possible though now. I think it is. I think if.
All right, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. All right, the BCS championship game clearly is going to be Georgia and Florida. So
Florida or Oregon could.
Florida would have to lose.
I think what the last week proved is that we don't know.
Yeah.
And we never do. Every year this happens where those teams start losing, and it's exciting for Georgia to be where they've never been. But I think the whole idea for this week is to kind of put the brakes on that.
Yeah.
You got to beat Georgia Tech first.
How do you think, Gentry, this is going to work? Rick on the teleconference last night with us was it was comical. It was funny.
It really was.
How much he would. I think if you'd asked him his feelings on global warming, he would have turned back to I'm going to talk about Georgia Tech.
It's a terrible thing.
Yeah.
Georgia Tech.
Well, they study global warming at Georgia Tech. That's a good tech school. Does he need to do that? I mean, he's got a pretty veteran team that's been around the block. They've been in this position last year where they were in the SEC championship. They weren't quite in the same position where they were national championship implications, but they were in the championship game last year.
Well, for what it's worth, Nick Saban did the same thing today.
Only by following Mark Richt. Nick Saban clearly follows the lead of Mark Richt.
It's the same kind of game, though, in that it's an in-state rivalry game, and I think everybody respects what that means. I think if you're Georgia, this is a scarier game than Auburn was, for instance. And that was a rivalry game, and I think that the fear of losing that game is pretty strong.
Is that
coaches.
When you say the scarier game? Although with Auburn, I think Georgia Southern was probably a scarier game, and Georgia Southern was actually closer than Auburn. Is it because of the triple option? I mean, if you're Georgia, do you look at Georgia Southern was able to keep it close for a little bit until that last minute of the first half. That game was headed to be either a Georgia Southern lead or tie at the half. And Georgia Tech, all jokes aside about their defense and being an ACC school, Georgia Tech has more talent than Georgia Southern. Does that mean that this is a little bit of a worry for Georgia?
Well, you're talking about a team that's won 3 straight games in Georgia Tech. They're playing their best of the year right now. And coaches like to say that, but they really are. The defense obviously has had its issues for Georgia Tech, and I think that Georgia's offense is good enough to score some points. But if you look at the one game Georgia Tech has won over Georgia since Mark Richt has been the coach here, it was a shootout.
Right.
It was a game where a lot of points were scored. So I think, yes, did Rick need to do that?
Mm-hmm.
Well, did he need to not tell us about Rainbow and Ogletree for 4 weeks? Did he? It's the same. It's a mentality thing. If he starts talking about the SEC championship game and playing Alabama and yada yada yada, then it's a coach trying to control the headlines. He wants his team focused, and I understand that. And I think they need to be. I think Georgia Tech is the kind of team that could give them trouble if they're not ready to play, but I do think they'll be ready.
I think Georgia's defense against it is the key. I just don't see, even with the defense improving for Georgia Tech, I don't see how Georgia doesn't score half the time they have the ball at worst. I don't mean touchdowns necessarily, but I'd see Georgia scoring 24 points minimum, and I mean that's kind of their floor. And it's a matter of whether Georgia's defense will be able to get off the field. The nightmare scenario, other than the obvious special teams mistakes, interceptions, and fumbles, the nightmare scenario for Georgia is that Georgia Tech just keeps getting these 5-yard runs and
that's what's
going down the field and has the ball for 7 or 8 minutes, and fans are in the stands sitting there going, "When's our offense going to get on the field?"
Yeah, and I think Georgia Southern for the first half was able to do that with a lot of those pitches out wide where they were getting 6, 7, 8 yards, and Georgia was able to cut that out in the second half. And as you watch the game, the difference was the inside linebackers were jumping the plays in the second half. It's like they knew what was coming. You had a lot of plays where Christian Robinson, Alec Ogletree both kind of.
Do you think that's a lesson that, I mean, there's so much of a chess match here. Georgia Tech has obviously seen that too, so they're not going to run the exact same plays Georgia Southern did. But does it help Georgia a lot having faced this last week?
Absolutely.
Going into this one?
Absolutely. And I think that is something that is going to make it very difficult for Georgia Tech just because so much of this offense, when you face it, is just getting used to it. and you get in kind of a rhythm after a while, and you start seeing things a little quicker. You know, the little fake handoffs and pitches. I mean, you just have a better idea of what you're facing. And I think Georgia's defense got into a rhythm early in the third quarter against this offense. And if you're Georgia Tech, I'd be real concerned about that, just because this is rare that you face these kind of offenses 2 weeks in a row, and it really will help Georgia. I think
it may, I mean, it may be something. And my sense is that it may be a problem for the Alabama game for Georgia, but it is a boon. It was a help to face Georgia Southern last week, followed entering Georgia Tech. Hopefully, I don't know. We'll see. But switching subjects, we just walked in from checking our email, and Jarvis Jones is a finalist for the Bednarik Award.
Bednarik Award, Nagurski Award, Lombardi
basically,
Award.
if there's a defensive award out there that's for all defensive players and not a certain position, Jarvis is a candidate.
Thing is, he's going to have to beat out Teo for all these awards.
And Monte Teo of Notre Dame has the hype behind him.
And Clowney is up for a few of them too.
Clowney, he has the hype. These guys.
I think he beat out Clowney. I'm not so sure about Teo.
Yeah.
I think Teo has got a lot behind him.
Mark Richt going with the gray on gray today. He went with the Belichick look last week, gray on gray, walking out to practice right now. You have a Heisman vote, Gentry.
Hey, Gio, did you hear they're playing Georgia Tech this week?
Gentry has a Heisman vote. I have a Heisman vote. Are you seriously considering Jarvis Jones? For people that don't realize, it goes. You get 3 places. You get first place, second place, third place, and they all get added.
Such a strange year. I mean, nobody really. Some years with the Heisman, it's so easy that you know who it's going to be. Other years, you have maybe 2 or 3 guys standing out. This year, I mean, what do you have? I think this is going to be a year where
every time you have a guy that's going to win it, he, wets the bed. That's what happened to Colin Klein.
Colin Klein's out of it as of this game this week, and I think the door is open for a freshman like Manziel, or maybe even a defensive player to have a shot this time. And I think in terms of from a national perspective, I don't think Jarvis is going to make it to New York. And the only I mean, it hurt him to lose those 2 games. Mm-hmm. He could have padded his stats in those games, and so many people don't watch Georgia every week, so they're looking at it and they're going, well, how many sacks does he have? Or how many tackles for loss? And Jarvis has had a great year.
And he's not going to get the sacks. He'll be lucky to get 1 against Georgia.
The only way I see it happening is if he goes in there and forces, if he does what he did against Florida against Alabama.
It's still just not a high-profile game, although it's helped a little bit that Georgia is where it is. People are still going to be watching this game.
And also what's interesting is he's the only player on this team that's really up for a lot of national award. I mean, a lot of times you'll see a team that's ranked 3rd in the country where you have 5, 6 guys who are up for these things. And
they had 2 first-team All-Americans last year on defense, and they're only going to have 1 this year.
That's right.
And I was talking about, I'm on the AP All-American panel, and Todd Gurley most likely at this point is going to get one of my votes at tailback for probably 2nd team. I mean, you lead the SEC in rushing, even if you're a freshman. I know Manziel's the leading rusher, but Gurley's the top tailback rusher.
I think Gurley's probably the best tailback in the league. I mean, he's had the best year.
Yeah. Entering, you would have said Nile Davis, Arkansas, but Gurley's numbers are just hard to ignore. Also an interesting day. Gentry wanted to talk about how great a university Maryland is and how all alumni of Maryland are pretty smart journalists. And
it's a big day for the Maryland contingent. I'm curious what a certain alum thinks about a move that could shake up college sports pretty good now.
I won't go on and on about it because from a Maryland perspective.
I meant him.
Because, University of Georgia right there. Because all of you watching this, are, other than my mom, are Georgia fans, so you don't really care too much from Maryland's perspective. It's kind of a sad day. You grew up, as I did, watching Maryland against North Carolina and Duke and Virginia and NC State. But the thing is that ACC is gone, and so Maryland needed the money, so
Let's say the ACC breaks up. What does this mean for the SEC?
That's the key thing is I think this could be a domino for Maryland or for the ACC because now they're talking about replacing them with UConn, which doesn't. See. There's rumors. I don't know how many legs there are to it that Georgia Tech could be interested in the Big Ten. I think the Big Ten, if it weren't for geography, would definitely be interested in Georgia Tech if they're interested in Maryland because you're talking about those Atlanta TV cable households. So that would be interesting. If the ACC starts to split up, everyone would love Duke and Carolina. I think NC State, because it's in a good market in Raleigh, could be interesting. I've always said I thought Georgia or NC State and Virginia Tech were the two most interesting and likely ones
Tech would be the
for
one.
an SEC.
I think Va Tech
Yeah.
would be the one for the SEC. I've said it for years,
Yeah.
though, and I think Clemson is a perfect
But
team
you've
to
got
join.
South Carolina.
They're an
that-
SEC school
South-
as it is.
It doesn't add anything for the Florida State does, because Florida is such a big state. But Clemson is just it's Clemson and South Carolina. I just don't. I still think Clemson and Florida State could be a package deal for the Big 12 if all this happened.
Because that makes sense.
Now everyone out there thinks
Tallahassee should be in a
Yeah.
Midwestern conference.
geography has gone by the wayside, Gentry, and it's sad. But Maryland at least touches a couple. Maryland in some parts touches Ohio, and it does touch Pennsylvania. So I know, but well, it was like the
Maryland's
SEC.
like Washington D.C.
Do you remember when the SEC announced that Missouri was joining the league? That they put in their release that it touched Tennessee and Kentucky as like a sign for why it was going to go in the
Sure.
East.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. And don't even get me started on Legends and Leaders division. The only thing that was legendary at Maryland when I went there was my roommate's ability to shotgun beers. We'll just kind of turn this back to Georgia Tech, before we get too out of hand, because we could talk about expansion and that parlay.
We're not going to talk about basketball. The Indiana game.
Well,
starting in
because
about 5 minutes here.
we're posting this, and the Indiana-Georgia game is starting, and we obviously have no idea who's going to win that game, and so we don't want.
Oh yeah,
we don't want to be
It's
out.
gonna be a wire to wire.
We don't want to be outdated, and yeah. You judging on what you were saying earlier, you think Georgia should beat Georgia Tech? Maybe not comfortably, convincingly. That these games against triple option a lot of times aren't.
Maybe a lot
maybe
like-
similar to last year,
Yeah, I think a lot like last year.
but a little bit more of a shootout. Because last year, what was the final score like?
I think Georgia. What's the spread in this game? 14 points.
I've seen anywhere from 13 to 14. I'd probably take Georgia to cover,
I would too.
but
would
I
take
think
Georgia.
I
and
think
get
the
that.
spread's about where it should be. We'll be here next week to officially break down Georgia against Alabama, unless Auburn somehow beats them. I couldn't even finish the sentence. Georgia against Alabama. See you next week.